Hello everybody, this is Ensign Rickey, your YouTube resident redshirt, and welcome back to the Lower Decks. And today, I will be continuing on with my Ensign's review series. The episode I will be breaking down and discussing today is from the Star Trek franchise. I will be reviewing and discussing my favorite sci-fi franchise of all time, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This review will be all about Star Trek Deep Space Nine series premiere opener, Emissary. So, without further ado, let's jump in and take a look.
Mission, and it's likely one of us will be killed. The landing party will consist of myself, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Ensign Rickey.
Ah, crap.
Air date and episode number. This is the first aired episode of Deep Space Nine. The episode premiered on January 3rd, 1993. In the Star Trek timeline, this episode takes place on stardate 46379.1. which, after some research, calculates out to the May of the year 2369. However, in the very beginning of the episode, we get a sequence that depicts Sisko at the Battle of Wolf 359 on stardate 44002.3. In this battle, his ship, the Saratoga, gets critically damaged and he loses his wife but manages to get himself and his son Jake to an escape pod to safety. This sequence takes place directly after the TNG episodes Best of Both Worlds Part 1 on stardate 43989.1 or the December of the year 2366, and Best of Both Worlds 2 on stardate 44001.4, which calculates out to the January of 2367. So, both TNG episodes and Sisko sequence takes place from the December of the year 2366 through the January of the year 2367. So our first adventure on Deep Space Nine begins on stardate 46379.1, or the May of the year 2369. Directors, writers, and special guest actors. This episode was directed by David Carson. David Carson is a British director and producer, and his career spans over 40 years. He has directed and produced projects in television and in the movies. Born in England, Carson began directing movies in the early 80s in the UK. Carson then decided to move to America and try his hand at directing in the States. Prior to his transition, Rick Berman and David Livingston called for a meeting with Carson to hire him. It was there where he started his foray into the Star Trek universe with the Next Generation episode, The Enemy. After Star Trek, he would continue to work in America on several television and film projects. Carson was also responsible for the casting of actor Andreas Kostas for the role of the Romulan Tomalak in the episode. Andreas Kostas is perhaps most well known for his role as Ambassador Jakar on Babylon 5. Carson was also responsible for the casting of Armin Shimmerman for the role of Quark. Carson, who we will see a little later on down the line, directed 7 more episodes of Star Trek and 1 Star Trek film. Carson directed 4 episodes of The Next Generation and 4 episodes of Deep Space Nine. Carson also directed the TNG movie Generations, making him, along with actor-director Jonathan Frakes, one of the only 2 people who has directed a Star Trek feature for both television and the movies. Carson has worked on such projects as Alien Nation, LA Law, Homefront, Doogie Howser, MD, The Carrie Movie, Smallville, and The 10th Kingdom. This episode was written by Rick Berman and Michael Piller. These are very important people to Star Trek's history. So let's start with the man in charge of it all after Gene Roddenberry, Rick Berman. Rick Berman is an American writer, producer, director, and documentarian, and his career spans over 50 years. He has written and produced projects in television and in the movies. Born in New York City, Berman graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in English and in film production in 1967. Starting out his career as an independent film producer, director, and writer, Berman worked making documentaries and industrial films. One of Berman's clients included the United Nations, in which by 1977, Berman had traveled to over 90 different countries producing films for the UN. After working for the UN, Berman then worked as a senior producer at PBS, in which he produced children's programming until 1982. Then in 1984, Berman would get hired at Paramount as a director of current programming, overseeing projects such as Cheers and Family Ties. And then in 1986, Berman would get promoted to the vice president of Paramount Network's television division. In 1987, Rick Berman would meet with Gene Roddenberry to help him work with The Next Generation. This was to be a sequel series to Roddenberry's original Star Trek from the late 60s. After the first couple seasons of The Next Generation, Roddenberry's health would begin to fail dramatically, and he would start to become less involved in the show's production from day to day. Then in 1991, when Gene Roddenberry passed away, Rick Berman would then get promoted to the executive producer of Star Trek and become the new leader of the franchise. Berman would keep this position overseeing the completion of The Next Generation and all other Star Trek productions until 2005. For almost 20 years, this era of Star Trek would be called the Berman era, or the second golden age of Star Trek. Berman is credited with creating and overseeing The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, plus all 4 Next Generation film productions. In addition to his executive producer duties, Berman has writing credits in 53 episodes all across the different Star Trek series, as well as in all 4 TNG films. Berman is also credited with making a special guest appearance on the last episode of Cheers, along with other studio executives. Berman's name is also mentioned throughout the whole Star Trek franchise. His name appears on most of the ship plaques on each of the ship's bridge sets. The Enterprise D has a shuttle named Berman, as pictured here in the TNG episode Cause and Effect. The promenade on DS9 has a store called Berman's Dilithium Supply, as pictured here. And also, a 20th century rock and roll band on Earth is named Berman's Rainbow Dreamers in the DS9 episode Past Tense Part 2. Actor-director Jonathan Frakes directly credits Berman for giving him a chance to transition from an actor into a director. Berman has also done this for other Trek actors as well. If you happen to like anything that was produced from Star Trek from 1987 to 2005, Rick Berman was directly responsible for that. Berman has worked on such projects as Cheers, Family Ties, and MacGyver. And now for our second writer, and someone who is equally as important to Star Trek as much as Gene Roddenberry and Rick Berman, Michael Piller. Michael Piller is an American writer and producer, and his career spanned for over 50 years. He has written and produced projects for television and the movies. Piller was born in 1948 to a Jewish family in New York. His father was a Hollywood scriptwriter, and his mother was a successful songwriter. Piller graduated from the University of North Carolina and began his career in the 1970s as a news producer for CBS for their studios in New York, North Carolina, and Chicago. He would receive 2 Emmy Awards for news and journalism. In the 1980s, he would move to Los Angeles and start a career in the entertainment side of television, working as a programming executive for CBS's television drama division. He would begin writing scripts for television and was offered a staff writing position on the show Simon & Simon, becoming the show's producer only after 3 years. In 1989, Piller would be called by his longtime friend, Maurice Hurley, to script a few episodes for a new Star Trek series, which was now in its 2nd season. Piller agreed and joined the writing staff for the new show. Due to the unstable work climate throughout the show's production, there were many personnel changes made throughout Season 1 and Season 2. Piller would take over as co-executive producer of the series in its 3rd season, managing to put together a strong writing team and take the series to new heights. He would eventually become the executive producer of TNG into the show's finish. However, in TNG's 5th season, he would share the producing responsibilities with Jerry Taylor in order to help Rick Berman create a new Star Trek series for television. Along with Rick Berman and alumni writer Ira Steven Behr, this show would eventually be Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He would continue to work in the Star Trek franchise as an executive producer until 1997. He also shares a credit for co-creating Star Trek Voyager with Rick Berman and Jerry Taylor. In 1996, around Voyager's 4th season, Piller would leave the Star Trek franchise, only to return once more in 1997 to help write and produce the TNG film Insurrection. After his work in Star Trek, he would continue to write and develop other television shows until 2005. But in 2005, after a long illness, the legendary Michael Piller would pass away from head and neck cancer in Los Angeles. Piller has worked on such projects as Simon & Simon, Miami Vice, Legend, The Dead Zone, and Wildfire. On a personal note, Michael Piller was perhaps the most pivotal figure in the success of Star Trek past Gene Roddenberry. Before Piller came to Star Trek in the 2nd season of The Next Generation, it was a complete mess behind the scenes. Many of the writing staff would get fired or replaced at a moment's notice. The staff would not only fight with each other, but also with Gene Roddenberry and his lifelong lawyer, Leonard Maizlish. Michael Piller would take charge in the later half of Season 2 and manage to form a strong writing team and turn the show around into a staggering success. Piller took the Star Trek Alien of the Week story format and changed it into a format where the stories focus more on a narrative on the show's characters. Many herald this as a turning point in the series as a whole. Another huge contribution from Piller to the Star Trek franchise was his implementation of an open script policy. This was monumental. This allowed anyone to submit scripts for stories to the show. Some of these open submission scripts in turn led to many great episodes of Star Trek, such as Yesterday's Enterprise and The Bonding. This, in turn, opened the doors of the industry to many of the best writers Star Trek's ever had. The latter episode I mentioned, The Bonding, was an open submission script picked up by Michael Piller from an unknown writer at the time named Ronald D. Moore. Moore's script would get him hired as a full-time writer on the staff of The Next Generation. Ronald Moore would contribute a great deal to Star Trek during his tenure with the franchise, and he would go on to have a very successful career after Star Trek. So in retrospect, if Michael Piller had not joined and taken control of TNG in its 2nd season, it is very likely we wouldn't have had some of Ronald Moore's other great work, such as 2004's reimagined Battlestar Galactica. Moore is currently the executive producer of the popular novel-to-television series Outlander. Michael Piller is responsible for some of the best years of Star Trek we've ever had. So, do yourself a favor, when you get a time, please look up and pay tribute to Michael Piller. The man was an absolute legend and one of Star Trek's greatest heroes. In this episode, we also have 3 guest actors who also become reoccurring actors on DS9. This is something that DS9 was very good at during its run. DS9 was phenomenal for using its supporting cast to its fullest. We also get a guest appearance by Patrick Stewart, who reprises his roles of not only Jean-Luc Picard, but Locutus of Borg. For our first guest actor, we get Mark Alimo, and he plays Gul Dukat, who eventually becomes one of the main antagonists throughout the whole series. Gul Dukat is a Cardassian Gul, which is the rank title equivalent of a captain in Starfleet. Shortly before the series begins, Dukat was the prefect, or the leader overseeing the occupation of Bajor. This was before the Cardassian government withdraws its forces. Dukat took up residency on the station, which at time was called Terak Nor, and runs the occupation force from the orbit of Bajor. He is responsible for many of the atrocities experienced by the people of Bajor during this tumultuous time. Some of these hideous acts include genocide, slavery, and forced labor camps. When the story starts, Dukat returns to Deep Space Nine to visit, which is now occupied by both the forces of the Federation and the Bajoran Provisional Government. He is sent by the Cardassian High Command to investigate the dealings between the Federation and the Bajoran people. Mark Alimo is an American actor, and his career spans over 50 years. He has acted in roles on television, in the movies, and on stage. Alimo is a Wisconsin native born in Milwaukee. He then moved to New York City in the 1970s and pursued a career in theater, which in turn led him to his first television acting role. Alimo then worked on a multitude of television shows, often getting typecast as a villain-type character. Then in 1976, Alimo would make his movie acting debut in the film Dr. Black, Mr. Hyde. It wouldn't be very long until both in television and in the movies, he would have an extraordinary career. Then in the 1990s, he focused the last of his career efforts in the role of Gul Dukat in Deep Space Nine. Post-Star Trek, Alimo has only worked in television one more time in a voice acting role on Seth MacFarlane's Family Guy. Alimo holds a Star Trek title of being the first Romulan and Cardassian ever seen in the 24th century. Besides his role as Gul Dukat on Deep Space Nine, Alimo has worked in a slew of other roles for the Star Trek universe. You can see him here as Badar NDD in the TNG episode Lonely Among Us, here as the first Romulan we see in the 24th century, Commander T-Bach, in the TNG episode The Neutral Zone, here as the first Cardassian we see in the 24th century, Gul Macet, in the TNG episode The Wounded, and here as Frederick LaRock in the TNG episode Time Zero. Other than his roles in the Star Trek universe, Alimo is perhaps most well known as his role as Everett, a Martian security officer in the 1990 Schwarzenegger film Total Recall. Alimo has also worked on projects such as Total Recall, Tango and Cash, Gunsmoke, The Rockford Files, Kojak, BJ and the Bear, The Last Starfighter, and The Incredible Hulk. For our second guest actor, we have Camille Saviola, who plays the spiritual leader of the Bajoran people, Kai Opaka. Opaka is a Bajoran who is the spiritual leader of the Bajoran people. She rose to prominence during the occupation of Bajor, ultimately working to protect her people from the harsh Cardassian rule. For her actions during the occupation, she was awarded the title of Kai, which is considered to be the top rank of the spiritual hierarchy of Bajor. Opaka eagerly wants to meet Commander Sisko, as she believes his arrival holds a deeper spiritual meaning in the will of the prophets of Bajor. Camille Saviola is an American actress, singer, composer, and writer, and her career spans over 50 years. She has acted in roles on television, in the movies, and also on the stage. Saviola is a New York native who graduated from the High School of Music and Art. She would only go to college for a year, but started her career as the lead singer of the Margot Lewis Explosion. The Margot Lewis Explosion was a rock band in the 1970s. I wonder if they're better than Berman's Rainbow Dreamers. During the 1980s, she would ultimately switch to acting and land many successful supporting roles in her career. She is well known for her Broadway performances in plays such as Nine or Chicago. She has had a very successful television acting career, still appearing in many shows today. Other than her role of Kai Opaka in Deep Space Nine, Saviola is perhaps most well known for her role as Turtle's mom in the show Entourage. Saviola has worked on projects such as Entourage, Nip Tuck, ER, LA Law, Friends, and Addams Family Values. For our third special guest actor, we have Felicia M. Bell, who plays Benjamin Sisko's late wife, recently lost to him and Jake on the Saratoga. Jennifer will continue to appear throughout the series. Jennifer Sisko is the wife of Commander Benjamin Sisko and the mother of Jake Sisko. Her life was lost in an attack by Locutus aboard at the Battle of Wolf 359. She appears to Sisko again in visions given to him by the prophets inside the Bajoran wormhole. Felicia M. Bell is an American actress, and her career spans over 35 years. She has acted in roles in television and in the movies. Bell is a California native and started her acting career at the age of 18. Her first role was in the late 80s on the television series Hunter. Bell would find success in her television career, acting in roles on the daytime soap operas Days of Our Lives and General Hospital. She would continue to act in numerous small roles on television. Other than her role as Jennifer Sisko in Deep Space Nine, Bell is perhaps most well known for her role as Jessica Rogers, owner of the House of Soul, in the sci-fi series Nightman. Bell has worked on such projects as Nightman, Law & Order SVU, Smallville, ER, Hunter, and The Days of Our Lives. IMDb synopsis and personal synopsis. The IMDb synopsis says, when the troubled Commander Sisko takes command of a surrendered space station, he learns that it borders a unique stable wormhole. However, my personal synopsis for this episode is, time? What is this time? Story breakdown and galactic map position. The story itself is broken down into 8 acts, plus a beginning teaser. Everything initially starts up on Deep Space Nine, which is in the orbit of the planet Bajor. If we look at the map, Bajor is on the very edge of Cardassian claimed space. Cardassia is in a resource-starved part of the galaxy, and the Empire expanded its reach to search for more resources. This led to the occupation of Bajor. The Cardassian Union and the Federation of Planets haven't been on the greatest of terms. We find out later this leads to the formation of the separatist faction known as the Marquis. During the time of Emissary, the Federation was in talks with Cardassia about a possible truce or ceasefire. This area of space, the Cardassian and Federation border, was a hotbed for skirmishes and trouble. We can also see the Setlik system on the border as well. Chief Miles O'Brien often states his experience and memories of his time while posted to Setlik during the Cardassian and Federation border wars. More specifically, the Setlik III massacre. Also not too far away is the Badlands. The Badlands is a nearly inhabitable region of space that becomes the base of operations for the Marquis separatists. However, for a small part of the episode, we do get our first look into the Gamma Quadrant, most notably the Idran system. Though they don't know it yet, we can see that this is a mostly Dominion-occupied territory. The Bajoran wormhole connects these 2 points over a vast amount of space, 70,000 light-years to be exact. Later on down the line, our story will eventually spend quite some time in the Gamma Quadrant as the series progresses. So, our story finally begins in the orbit of Bajor on Deep Space Nine on stardate 46379.1 in May of the year 2369. Commander's Log.
Commence station log, Deep Space Nine, Commander Benjamin Sisko, stardate 46388.2. At the request of the Bajoran Provisional Government, Starfleet has agreed to establish a Federation presence in the system following the withdrawal of the Cardassian occupational forces. The first contingent of officers, including my Chief of Operations, Miles O'Brien, arrived 2 days ago on the Enterprise.
The teaser. So, unlike previous Star Trek series openers, this time we get a glimpse into Sisko's past at the Battle of Wolf 359. We open up with a Star Wars text-like scroll giving us a little backstory into the events before Deep Space Nine. Star Trek Voyager will also take this idea and use it for their season opener, Caretaker. We open up with a shot of Locutus of Borg with their usual Borg greeting, resistance is futile. And then we get our very first shot of our leading man, Commander Benjamin Sisko, aboard the USS Saratoga. The Vulcan captain calls out for a red alert as the ship approaches the Borg cube. The Saratoga flies in and begins to open fire on the cube. The cube then answers back, taking out one of the Federation's attacking starships. The Borg cube then fires and locks onto the Saratoga, and it begins to drain the Saratoga shields. Another pair of Federation ships start to close in to help the Saratoga. They begin to fire at the cube as it holds the Saratoga in place. Locutus aboard then looks at the view screen and sees the other 2 ships closing in and attacking. Aboard the Saratoga, the con officer states to the crew that the shields are being drained. The captain then asks the crew to modulate the shields, but the Boolean officer in the back says there's no effect. Sisko then commands the ship to reverse. But it's too late. The Borg cube launches an attack and critically damages the Saratoga. The Vulcan captain then gives the order to evacuate, but then is blown out of his chair due to an explosion. The Saratoga starts to fall apart as the crew gets tossed all over the place, explosion after explosion. Sisko gets rocked by one of the explosions and is thrown to the ground, but is very much alive. He finds out he is also able to move. He slowly gets up and then asks the computer for a damage report, and then sees a crew member that was next to him also hurt by the explosion. He goes down to see if he can help her, but finds out that she is very much dead. He then asks the computer again, and finally it replies. The computer tells Sisko that the warp core has been breached. and the ship will explode within 5 minutes. The Bolian officer finally gets to his feet and informs Sisko that many decks have been breached, and they have to go. Sisko then asks the Bolian officer, who we now see as a lieutenant, to help him get the civilians to the escape pods. They end up heading down a hallway as the ship collapses around them. Sisko then asks a lady passing by if she's seen his wife Jennifer. The woman is so shaken up and frantic that she can't even answer Sisko. Sisko then rushes to his quarters to check on Jennifer and his son Jake. He finally makes it to the door of his quarters and sees that the room is in flames and had been damaged in the attack as well. He enters and knocks the debris out of his way as he enters. He calls out for Jennifer, but there is no reply. As he enters further, another ship blows up outside the window as he continues his search. He finally looks over and sees Jake unconscious on the floor, covered in some debris. Frantically, Sisko goes down and clears all the junk out of the way and digs young Jake Sisko out. He sets Jake down for a second to look for Jennifer. Sisko now sees that Jennifer was knocked unconscious from the attack's blast and is also stuck under a pile of debris herself. As he tries to lift the debris off of Jennifer, the Bolian lieutenant comes back in to find Sisko and help him out. The Bolian officer pulls out a tricorder and uses it on Jennifer. He then looks to Sisko and tells him that she's dead and there's nothing they can do and they have to go. Sisko, overcome with grief, still tries to get Jennifer free. The Bolian lieutenant then picks up young Jake and hands him off to an ensign to get him to the escape pods. Still unwilling to leave Jennifer behind, the Bolian officer grabs Sisko and starts to pull him out of the room. Sisko makes it to the escape pod and looks around to find Jake. He finally sees Jake and runs up to hug him. He sits Jake down and we get an awesome scene as the escape pod pulls away from the Saratoga. Sisko then looks out the window at the doomed ship. The Saratoga then explodes, and Sisko watches looking out the window, stuck in a whirlwind of emotions. And then we get a final shot of Sisko looking out the window like he is ready to stomp someone. Sisko then bows his head in grief, and then we fade out. And then we head 3 years into the future on stardate 46379.1. The scene opens up in an Earth-type setting and we see Jake Sisko, a little older now, sitting on a bridge fishing. Commander Sisko then finds Jake and comes out to greet him. He takes a seat next to Jake and they begin to talk about moving to Deep Space Nine. But Jake seems to be pretty unhappy about moving to the space station and we get this little scene.
So why can't we live on the planet instead of some old space station?
The station is in orbit of Bejor. It'll be just like shore duty.
Will there be kids there?
Absolutely, lots of kids.
Basically, I lied.
Yep, plenty of kids. This gets interrupted as an officer calls out for Commander Sisko over the comm and informs him they are getting close to Deep Space Nine. The commander and Jake get up and start walking. As they are walking, we see the surrounding scene fade away and leaving nothing but a blank holodeck room. As they exit the holodeck, Jake looks up to see DS9 out the window of the ship. He then asks the commander if that's the station. Sisko replies yes, and they both walk off. The camera then zooms in on Deep Space Nine through the window, and we fade into Act 1. So, we open up with a nice shot hovering around the station in the middle of the commander's log. We see that the Enterprise D is also docked at one of the station's rings. And then we get our first shot of the promenade, which has been left in ruins from the Cardassian occupation of Bejor. Sisko, along with Miles O'Brien and Jake, walk out of the door and take a look at the torn apart and gutted promenade. They continue to look at the scene, and Miles goes on to say the Cardassians had some fun before they left. He adds that 4 shopkeepers have lost their lives protecting their stores. They all walk for a bit, and then have a small discussion talking about Major Kira and the repair operations of the station. Miles then states that many of the residents are leaving the station because they've lost everything. And then we get our first shot of Quark's bar, and it looks like the Ferengi are packing up and leaving too. And then a mysterious robed Bajoran steps out of a doorway and begins to confront Sisko and O'Brien. He then urges for Sisko to step inside the door because the prophets await him. Sisko refuses the offer, saying perhaps another time. The man then nods and agrees with Sisko and then says, another time. In Sisko's defense, I would be pretty creeped out by that guy too. They eventually arrive at Sisko's new quarters, and O'Brien mentions that Jake should probably not walk around due to the current security issues. Jake, clearly not too happy with the situation, adds that there's no bed and there's only a mat on the floor. O'Brien then replies that they'll get one off the Enterprise for him. He then adds that Captain Picard would like to see Sisko as well. Sisko asks O'Brien if he has heard anything about the other medical and science officers that are supposed to arrive. Brian retorts tomorrow. Sisko then tells Jake to stay in their quarters until he comes back. Jake, now standing in front of a replicator that looks in severe disrepair, asks if the device even works. O'Brien then replies no, that they are all offline and are in the process of being repaired. Jake starts to protest, but then Sisko cuts him off and calls him over to him. He embraces Jake and then tells him that they're going to have to rough it until things get repaired. Jake unenthusiastically retorts, okay. Sisko and Brian then head off to the station's operations center. Both Sisko and O'Brien arrive at Ops via the turbolift. O'Brien then shows Sisko around a bit and shows him the prefect's office. Sisko then mentions that it's above, and all others have to look up and respect Cardassian architecture. O'Brien then adds that Major Kira is now using the prefect's office. Sisko then decides it's time to pay Major Kira a visit. Sisko enters the office and walks in the middle of a conversation between Major Kira and a minister from the provisional government on Bajor. Sisko then notes that the conversation is not going well, and Major Kira seems to be pretty pissed. When the man on the other end tries to reply, Kira, then enraged with the whole situation, ends the message abruptly. Kira, still mad, now looks up to see that Sisko had entered the office, and he starts to introduce himself. But instead of hello, Kira instantly asks Sisko if he wants the office and is obviously upset with seeing him. Sisko acknowledges that he indeed wants the office, but he just wanted to say hi first. But they can do it in any order that she likes. Kira then looks at the commander and sarcastically says hello, and this puts Sisko on guard a bit. Sisko then approaches it a bit and asks her if something is wrong. Kira responds with a barrage of emotions, saying that she feels the Federation has no business being here. This tiny little line of dialogue given here by Kira sums up the best description of the overall tone of Deep Space Nine as a whole, in my opinion. She goes on to say that she's been fighting for Bajoran freedom her whole life, and she totally disagrees with the provisional government's decision to send the Federation in for help. Sisko mentions the provisional government disagrees with her, and the Federation is only here to give its support to help Bajor. He then adds that he requested a Bajoran national for a first officer because it made sense. She starts to respond, but then they are cut off by a security alarm and a comm message from Odo, the station security officer. They detect that there has been a break-in on the promenade, and Kira starts to head off, telling Sisko that they have been having a lot of break-ins lately. As she moves past him, she replies it's nothing for him to worry about. Sisko then gives a little mischievous smile, and then follows Kira despite her advice. And then we open up with a shot of a Ferengi looking out a security grate, telling whoever he's with to hurry up. The Ferengi runs over to his companion, and now it's painfully obvious that these two are up to no good, and probably the cause for the recent alarm. With bags of stolen goods in hand, both of them leave from under a cut security grate. When free, they start to run away through the promenade, but then they are stopped dead in their tracks by the station security chief Odo. Then we get our first shot of Odo in person as he descends upon the two burglars. They try to turn and run from him, but then are held fast by Kira and Sisko closing in behind them. The Ferengi's companion decides to stand and fight, brandishing a small morning star, and begins to wind it up for the throw. And then we get a beautiful CGI scene as the Ferengi's friend throws the weapon at Odo. Odo, however, is a shapeshifter, and he lets the weapon fly straight through his face with no harm. The weapon then implants itself on a pillar behind Odo. Confused, the attacker starts to flee but then is cut off by Odo. Odo starts to pin him up against a wall to restrain him, but is interrupted by a phaser blast by Sisko, prompting both men to stop. Odo now looks back at Sisko saying, "Who the hell are you?" The look on Odo's face is great here. Kira then says to Odo that this is the new station commander. Odo lets a security officer take the burglar and then he approaches Sisko. He openly states to the commander that he doesn't allow weapons on the promenade, and that includes phasers. Now, my only gripe with this scene is, where the hell did Sisko get the phaser from? I mean, before this scene, we don't see it on his person, and then after this scene, we don't see it on his person again. I mean, where does he hide this thing? I mean, you would think you would see a bulge somewhere. But on Starfleet uniforms, where are you gonna hide anything? I mean, Jesus Christ, they don't even have pockets. But yeah, that's the only thing that really gets me in this scene, is Sisko's disappearing and reappearing phaser. Well anyway, back to the story. But then from a doorway, Quark appears and calls out for his nephew Nog, and both Sisko and Odo turn to look at him. Odo then goes over to Nog and explains that he's in a lot of trouble. Quark then approaches Sisko and introduces himself as the bar's manager. He also adds that he is the uncle of the young Ferengi in question, who we now know as Nog. He then tries to bargain with Sisko to let Nog go since they are leaving the station anyway. Sisko refuses the request outright and then asks Odo to take Nog to the brig. Quark, now speechless, turns to leave. Sisko and Kira leave the scene and have a small discussion about Quark. Sisko adds that he might let Nog go, but he wants something more important from Quark in return. O'Brien then calls Sisko over the comm and reminds Sisko that the Enterprise is hailing again and Captain Picard is waiting to speak to him. He turns to Kira and says, "This won't take long." And then he leaves and makes his way to the Enterprise D. And then we fade into Act 2. We open up with a nice shot of the Enterprise D attached to Deep Space Nine, and then we head into the observation room as Sisko enters to meet Captain Picard. This is a rather nice scene played out by two amazing actors. Picard opens up with a friendly stance and addresses Sisko as he comes in to meet him. Sisko then says, "It's been a long time, Captain," and Picard is taken back, asking if they've met before. Sisko replies, "Yes, sir. We met in battle," and that he was on the Saratoga at Wolf 359. Picard's expression then turns completely sour here as he hears Sisko's words. And again, I have to note that the acting and the expressions given in this scene by both actors is top-notch material. It is not many times that we see the good old Captain Picard in a position as vulnerable or as defensive as this. Picard takes Sisko's words as a literal blow to the chest, and Patrick Stewart plays this off perfectly. On Avery's part, you can see the contained inner rage in Sisko's face as he's talking to Picard, almost like at any moment he's about to jump over and smash Picard where he sits. I just had to point out the great performance of both men in this scene. Absolutely phenomenal. Now, back to the story. After the small awkward moment, Picard then asks the commander if he's been briefed as both men sit down to discuss the situation on Bajor. Sisko replies, "Yes." Picard then states that he has come to know the Bajorans, and he is in favor of Bajor joining the Federation. He then adds that it's Sisko's job to make sure this happens by any means necessary, short of violating the Prime Directive. Picard then sits down and pours some tea and tells Sisko that he has been made aware by Starfleet of his objection to the assignment. Sisko agrees, and then adds that this is hardly the ideal place to raise his son. Picard retorts with the normal Starfleet rhetoric, saying Starfleet officers don't have the luxury, blah 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 blah. Sisko replies he realizes that, but he's been thinking about taking a civilian assignment back on Earth. Picard then says perhaps Starfleet should be looking for a replacement for Sisko, and that he'll look into it. Picard starts to talk, but then is cut off by Sisko as he rises out of his chair, saying, "In the meantime, I will do my job to the best of my abilities, sir." Ooh, the rage. Picard, not wanting to take this meeting any further, finally dismisses Sisko. Now, the only thing that gets me in this scene is that you think Picard would do a small investigation into any officer he was going to personally interview. Like, after Picard's time as Locutus of Borg, you think he would be a little more knowledgeable and careful in meetings like this. I mean, he is the reason that many people, along with their loved ones, lost their lives. Locutus and the Borg committed many atrocities against the Federation and its citizens. Just saying. But overall, it's still a phenomenal scene played out by two amazing actors. Back on the promenade, we see the crews working to repair the station. Then we head into Sisko's office as he's conducting an interview with Odo and Quark. Sisko opens up by telling Quark that he's not going to leave the station. Quark replies that he's already packed up, and why would Sisko want him to stay in the first place? Odo, also intrigued by Sisko's request, banters back and forth with Quark about him being a gambler and a thief, thus beginning one of the best love-hate relationships on DS9 ever. And of course, Quark quickly dismisses all the accusations. You can also notice that Odo's face is more defined in this episode and gets smoother as the series goes on. Sisko breaks up the little argument and adds in that in exchange for Nog's freedom, Quark will stay and act as the community leader. Quark begins to laugh outright in total disbelief and mockingly repeats Sisko's statement, "Community leader." Sisko's plan is for Quark to stay and show the residents that they are rebuilding and provide services to Starfleet personnel being sent to help the station. Quark, not totally convinced yet, gets up and says how could he run his business under Starfleet regulations. Sisko replies that Starfleet's only here to keep the peace on the station. It's still a Bajoran station, and if Quark runs fair and honest games, he'll have no problems from Starfleet. Quark, still reluctant, tries to object, but then Sisko uses Nog's freedom as a bargaining chip. Quark is then blackmailed into staying. Sisko leaves and Odo replies to Quark, now defeated. At first, he didn't think he was going to like Sisko. Sisko, now back on the promenade, sees Major Kira working on the cleanup and approaches her. As soon as Kira notices Sisko, she tells him that all the other workers are repairing the primary systems. Kira then makes a verbal jab at Sisko about Starfleet officers not wanting to get their hands dirty, but then Sisko goes and proves her accusation wrong by helping her and getting his hands dirty. Even though Kira says his remark is a verbal jab at Sisko, she's not exactly far from the truth about Starfleet. Kira and Sisko start talking for a while about Quark's decision to leave the station and the situation on Bajor. Kira adds that when the provisional government falls, Bajor will erupt into a civil war. She goes on to say that the only person that could stop it is Kai Opaka, who is the spiritual leader of Bajor. Kira continues on saying that Bajorans are a deeply spiritual race and they are all very religious. If Kai Opaka were to call for unity, all the major Bajoran factions would listen, but now the Kai lives in seclusion and rarely sees anyone at all. But then, this all gets interrupted by the creepy robed Bajoran man that stopped Sisko earlier. The man then replies, "It's time." And then, both Sisko and the creepy Bajoran robed man leave and head to Bajor. But before we go any further, this is what gets me about this whole going to see the Kai idea. First off, Kira mentions that the Kai is the only person that can bring peace to Bajor, but then she went into seclusion and since then has been waving off all the factions that are trying to see her for her advice. Kira also mentions that the Kai very rarely sees anyone at all. Now Sisko, on the other hand, has been running around the whole episode forced to attend meetings that he doesn't even want to be in. He'd just rather not be there and he pushes these meetings off as far as he can. So, if I was Bajoran and we just got our freedom back after 50 years of fighting oppression, and I wanted to go see the Kai for whatever reason, or perhaps I just wanted to look at her to restore my faith, I would be shit out of luck. I'm sure this wouldn't make me happy as a devout religious follower. They are all saying that it takes one word from this woman, and all of Bajor just changes for the better. She can restore peace to a devastated civilization, and yet she sees no one and doesn't even make an attempt to start any sort of peace talks. So basically, she just lets the turmoil sink into Bajor while she sits in seclusion in her temple. Some holy leader. But Sisko comes along, who's not even Bajoran, and her door just opens right up. Come right on down to the temple, Commander. Sisko is literally just trying to take the dog for a walk, and he can care less about this meeting, but he instantly gets summoned by this crazy robed Bajoran guy, along with the Kai, the spiritual leader of Bajor, just to come down and have a friendly chat. This just feels weird to me, I guess. Well, anyway, let's continue. So we get a beautiful pan over Bajor's capital city and then zoom into the Temple of the Kai. Sisko enters, walks around for a while, and waits for Kai Opaka to see him. Opaka finally comes in to see the commander and she apologizes to him for the wait. She sits down next to Sisko and then grabs his ear and asks him to breathe. Sisko seems very uncomfortable with this. Opaka then asks Sisko if he's ever explored his path, or as she explains it, his life force. Then she states to Sisko, ironic, the one who does not want to be among us is to be the emissary. No foreshadowing here. She then asks Sisko to follow her as she hits a button and the fountain becomes a staircase. She starts heading down and we get a nice acknowledgement of admiration from Sisko as he looks at the holographic fountain with a sly smile. Sisko and Opaka then go down the staircase. They both end up in a cave under the temple, and Sisko and Opaka exchange a few words about the state of Bajor. She states that Bajor is in trouble. Well, no surprise there, but she can't act or move until the prophets have been warned. And then they make it to a room, and then we get our first shot of the mysterious glowing orbs of Bajor, known as the Tears of the Prophets. She explains to Sisko that she cannot give him what he denies himself, and then she parts and leaves Sisko with the shining green orb. Sisko stares into the orb, and then is whisked away onto a beach somewhere. When the scene begins to materialize, Sisko looks around. He feels the hot sand on his feet, and he also realizes he's holding a tray of lemonade glasses. He begins to stomp around in the sand to cool his feet, and then accidentally knocks sand on a woman sunbathing on the beach. She asks him what his problem is, except that Sisko now realizes that he's talking to his long-dead wife, Jennifer. He then recalls that this is the place they first met, and he speaks her name. The woman responds, although she's confused, and then asks Sisko if they've met last night at a party. In a state of disbelief and happiness, Sisko offers Jennifer a lemonade. Jennifer refuses Sisko's request for the lemonade, but they both get up and start walking down the beach having a small discussion. Sisko does confirm that George told him her name and that they did meet last night at the party. Sisko then puts on the suave and asks Jennifer to join him for dinner tonight, and he will cook his father's aubergine stew. But before Jennifer can answer back, an orb appears on the beach, and Sisko unwillingly is whisked back to the Bajoran temple in the presence of Kaiopaka. Sisko, still shaken up about the whole ordeal, finds himself listening to Kaiopaka as she explains that 9 orbs like this have appeared over Bajor in the last 10,000 years. She adds that the Cardassians have the other orbs and tasks Sisko with finding the Celestial Temple before the Cardassians do. She says if the Cardassians find the temple first, they will destroy it. Sisko, still confused by the whole situation, asks Kaiopaka that if in the last 10,000 years no Bajorans have been able to find the Celestial Temple, how is he supposed to find the Celestial Temple? And in all honesty, Sisko does have one hell of a point. Kaiopaka then gives the orb to Sisko and tells him that he will find the Celestial Temple, if not for Bajor, if not for the Federation, but for himself. With orb in hand, Sisko then departs back to Deep Space Nine, and then we fade into Act 3. So, we open up with a shot back on DS9. Sisko is watching Jake sleep and reminiscing about how much he looks like Jennifer. Jake wakes up for a split second, but then goes back to sleep. Meanwhile, Major Kira calls Sisko and asks him to come down to the promenade. He then tells her he's on his way. Sisko arrives off the turbo lift and heads to the promenade. But to his amazement, business at Quark's establishment is booming. Everyone seems to be having a great time, and Sisko seems pleased by this event. He takes a seat at the bar, and then Quark comes over and addresses the commander. Quark then asks Sisko if he wants anything. Sisko then asks Quark how the local synth ale is. And then Quark comes back with one of the greatest lines ever. Definitely his best dialogue in this episode. Quark replies, "The Bajorans make a dreadful ale, and to never trust ale from a God-fearing species." He then adds, "or a Starfleet commander that has your relative in jail." Sisko seems to be amused by Quark's words. Then we get a nice shot of a ship coming into DS9 and a small commander's log saying that the science and medical officers have arrived. The ship that brought the medical and science officers, the USS Cochrane, has some history behind it, and we'll get to that later. Sisko also mentions in his log that 3 runabout shuttles have come in as well. Then we head off into the docking port and get a little more exposition as Jadzia Dax and Dr. Julian Bashir make an appearance. They meet Kira and Sisko at the door. The meeting ends up getting cut short because Sisko already has an assignment for Jadzia to study the Bajoran orb. But before the party departs, Julian asks Dax on a dinner date, or perhaps for a drink. Dax, flattered, accepts. Dax and Sisko then walk off and talk a little bit about Julian hitting on her, and that she is the same old Dax, more or less. Just a small thing about Julian here. In the first couple seasons of DS9, they make him out to be this total creeper. Just the way he approaches women in general is awkward. Not even 10 seconds after we meet him for the first time, he's already asking Jadzia on a date. I mean, he wastes no time with this whatsoever. He does finally break out of this mold a little later on in the series, and his character grows, but the writers didn't really make him to be this pushy creep guy for the first couple seasons. Just saying. Sisko and Dax then head off to study the orb, and then we get a scene of the gutted and ransacked sickbay with Kira and Bashir. Kira explains that they have many security issues, and the Cardassians took anything that had any worth to it. Julian seems a little more excited about the sickbay, saying that this is where he wanted to be. He could have had any posting. He wanted to be out on the frontier because this is where heroes are made, out here in the wilderness. Kira, not buying any of this, starts to get infuriated with Bashir, and then explains that this wilderness is her home. Dumbfounded, Bashir has no clue how to respond to this. So, Kira then tells the young doctor to go start helping the sick and injured. The doctor watches as Kira walks out, still in a defensive posture, and sighs. He already knows that this is going to be a pretty tough place. Then we head into the science lab as we see Sisko and Dax trying to figure out the orb. Sisko adds that there have been monks that have dedicated their lives to finding this temple for over 10,000 years. He goes back and forth with Jadzia for a bit, and then Sisko finally departs calling Dax Old Man. This was a name he used for Curzon Dax, the host before Jadzia. This also has a double meaning that we will get into later in the trivia section. As soon as Sisko departs, Jadzia asks the computer to do a 10,000-year search on anything related to the Bajoran orbs. The computer complies with her request, but then Jadzia herself is drawn into the orb as she tries to close the box it's held in. Very much in the same way Sisko did, Jadzia gets whisked away, but she gets whisked away to her surgery alongside Curzon Dax. This was the day that she became the new host for the Dax symbiote. She calls out for Curzon and he smiles. The doctors then easily cut the symbiote out and Curzon instantly dies. Then the Dax symbiote gets placed in Jadzia, who looks scared at the moment. But as soon as Dax enters her body, she gets this serene look in her eyes, and everything turns out fine. And before she knows it, she then gets whisked back to the lab on DS9. Then she wonders what just happened. She shrugs it off and then continues. Meanwhile, we get another shot of the Enterprise D still in dock with DS9. O'Brien enters the bridge of the Enterprise D to take one last look. He comes to the ready room door, but stops himself from entering, not to bother Captain Picard. A lieutenant then approaches O'Brien, telling him that Captain Picard is in the ready room, and if he would like to see him. O'Brien declines the offer, and then he heads to the teleporter room. He asks the young ensign in the teleporter room to teleport him to Ops on DS9. But before she can comply with the request, Captain Picard enters the room. He mentions that he missed O'Brien on the bridge. O'Brien tells Picard that he didn't want to bother him. Picard then strikes up a small conversation about this transporter room being O'Brien's favorite. O'Brien confirms that, indeed, it is his favorite transporter room. Transporter room 3. Picard says it won't be the same without O'Brien, but O'Brien replies, "It's just a transporter room." With that, Picard smiles and then steps behind the transporter room's controls, and then sends O'Brien off to DS9. We then get a shot of the Enterprise D leaving DS9 to continue his mission, and then we fade into Act 4. Back at DS9, a Cardassian ship approaches the station on the view screen. O'Brien says to everyone the ship is hailing and mentions that it's convenient for them to show up now that the Enterprise had just left. He adds that it's Gul Dukat, and he wants to meet with Commander Sisko. Kira instantly shows her displeasure at the sound of his name. She then explains that he was the prefect of Bajor during the occupation. Sisko starts to walk up to the view screen and tells O'Brien to accept Dukat's offer for a meeting. Dukat enters Sisko's office and addresses the commander. He then makes it a point right away to mention that this meeting is weird to him because this was his office only 2 weeks ago. He adds that he's not used to being on this side of the desk. Sisko smiles and retorts with a great line saying Dukat can stop back and visit anytime he's feeling homesick. Dukat gives a sarcastic thanks to the commander and responds in kind with some carefully veiled threats. Dukat explains to Sisko that he's far from the Federation, and if he had any trouble, his Cardassian neighbors would be quick to respond. Sisko then sits back and collects his thoughts for a while. Dukat then mentions to Sisko that he knows that Sisko went to the surface to speak with Kai Opaka. He goes on to say that he knows that Sisko had brought back an orb. Sisko then stands up and denies Dukat's accusations. Dukat then asks Sisko if his officers can use the station's facilities while they're here. Sisko agrees, and with that, Dukat departs. After the meeting with Dukat, Sisko then heads to the science lab to meet with Jadzia and see if she's had any luck in studying the orb. Jadzia explains that by using the historical data given to them by the Bajoran monks, she might have pinpointed the location of the Celestial Temple. She pops up the calculations on the screen, and the computer shoots back an image. Jadzia then says that all the signs are pointing to a place in the system called the Denorius Belt. She adds that in one of the monks' stories, the heavens had opened up and swallowed his ship whole. Sisko then starts to formulate a plan to go visit the Denorius Belt. He goes on to say that the Cardassians are all over the station, and that they would be most likely detected if they attempted to leave. Both Sisko and Dax start to work on a plan. Meanwhile, back at Quark's, business is booming, and the Cardassians are all gambling, but some of them appear to be winning big. Kira and O'Brien then storm through the door. Kira grabs a cup from the bar and bangs it on the table to get everyone's attention. Kira explains that she's shutting down the operations of the bar. Quark, along with many of the other customers, shout out in dismay. O'Brien then goes up to Quark and says if he has a problem, he can take it up with the commander. Quark then says to O'Brien he intends to do just that. Quark then motions for his workers to get a bag for the Cardassian winners to put their winnings in. But this is all a well-planned ploy. Now, take note. This is the very first episode of DS9, and they have the whole crew working together to achieve a goal. This is something that DS9 in general is very good at doing, teamwork. Quark's assistant hands him the bag, but the bag itself is really Odo in disguise. The Cardassians take their winnings and put it all inside the bag, and then we get a nice shot of a Cardassian Gaylord-class warship next to DS9. The Cardassians return to the ship with bag in hand and place the Odo bag inside a compartment in the hallway. Odo then begins to shapeshift into a liquid in order to escape the compartment. He begins to ooze out of the grate onto the floor. Odo then begins to take his normal shape again, and then heads on down to the hall, to the control room. Meanwhile, back on DS9, Sisko and Dax head to a docking port and enter one of the new roundabout shuttles the Federation had sent to Deep Space Nine. Sisko begins the takeoff procedure. He contacts Kira and O'Brien and Ops, asking if they are ready to go. O'Brien mentions that the Cardassian ships are showing power fluctuations. Kira runs over to a console and adds that Odo had disabled the Cardassian ship's computers. She then tells Sisko that they are ready to go. Here, we get a nice shot of the new runabout shuttle as it rises out of DS9 and begins to take off. Kira then tells O'Brien that Odo is ready in the transport location. O'Brien then replies that he's never done a transport with Cardassian technology, and he starts to get frustrated. He eventually kicks the console, and then Odo teleports in. Kira then tells Odo, "Good work." Odo retorts with a nod. Then, we get a nice shot of the runabout leaving the station, and then we fade into Act 5. We open up with Sisko and Dax on a runabout heading off to find the temple. Dax starts to put the coordinates into the computer. Kira and O'Brien are listening in. Dax says she is sensing high amounts of proton counts. Sisko sets the coordinates into that direction. Dax says that the wave intensities are getting stronger from the spot, but not inside the runabout's cabin. She goes on to question how this is even possible, but then she's immediately interrupted by a white bright flash as the wormhole appears in front of them. The shuttle gets sucked inside the wormhole. The wormhole then collapses into nothing. Inside the wormhole, the shuttle is shaking from side to side. Sisko says the controls are not responding. Dax adds that communications have been cut off from the station as well. Back on the station, O'Brien says there's a massive subspace distortion in the area. Kira chimes in and asks what the hell is happening out there. O'Brien replies he doesn't know, they just disappeared. Now inside the wormhole, the runabout's controls are still failing to respond and the shuttle is still shaking considerably. All of a sudden, the wormhole opens again, and the runabout pops out back into open space. Sisko and Dax finally get the shuttle back under their control, and then they ask the computer for their coordinates. The computer complies with the request and then starts to chart a star a couple light years away. The computer then responds, the Idron system. Sisko responds, that can't be right. That's 70,000 light years from Federation space, in the Gamma Quadrant. Dax then asks the computer how it came to this conclusion. The computer responds that a probe was sent out around the 22nd century, and it charted this system. Sisko, now in disbelief, says to Dax that they have found a wormhole. Dax then responds that it's not like any wormhole she's ever seen. Sisko then replies that if what the monk said was true, then this wormhole's been out here for over 10,000 years. He also adds they may have found the only stable wormhole known to exist. Dax then brings the shuttle about. The shuttle turns around and the wormhole opens once more. Sisko and Dax then head inside the wormhole once again. Inside the wormhole, Dax tries to compensate for the shuttle's heading to make the ride a little less bumpy. Sisko then notices that the gauges on the screen are starting to decrease. He then asks Dax if she is reducing power to the impulse engines. Dax responds no and asks him why. Sisko says they are rapidly losing velocity and the shuttle is slowing down. The shuttle then starts to decrease in speed rapidly, and Dax says she's picking up breathable atmosphere on the sensors. Sisko retorts, in a wormhole? The shuttle then comes to a complete stop and then lands. Sisko exits out the shuttle and steps into a dark, hostile environment. He starts to walk down a path. Dax then leaves the shuttle, but unlike Sisko, she walks into a peaceful and sunny environment. She then looks out to Sisko and sees him walking away in the distance. Dax then runs to catch up with Sisko, still in the green field and still in amazement of the beautiful scene in front of her. She replies to Sisko, "It's beautiful, And then Sisko turns around with this look like, "Are you effing nuts?" He then turns around and looks at the hostile environment and replies to Dax that she's got a strange eye for beauty. She responds, "You don't think this place is beautiful?" Sisko retorts, "We are standing on a rock face," and asks her, does she even see the storm? Dax quietly responds, "No, it's as clear as a summer's day." This little scene gets interrupted as an orb appears out of nowhere and starts to float towards them. Dax then whips out a tricorder as the orb uses a beam and scans both Dax and Sisko. Dax then confirms the orb is indeed scanning them with a low-level ionic pattern. The orb then finishes scanning Dax and then flies off between the two. Sisko then tries to communicate with the orb. The orb sends out a shockwave and knocks both Sisko and Dax to the ground. Dax slowly starts to get up, but as she's doing that, the scene starts to change back and forth into the scene that Sisko had described. The orb now sends out a wave that encompasses Dax, and she disappears, and then floats off. Sisko, still on the ground, looks around trying to get his balance back, but then the ground starts to crack open around him, and light beams protrude from underneath the surface. Now trapped, Sisko stays put and watches the ground cave in around him. Everything disappears, and Sisko is surrounded by a blinding white light. Meanwhile, the wormhole opens again, but this time an orb is coming through. Back in Ops on DS9, O'Brien says he's sensing an elevated neutrino count. Kira says it doesn't seem to be a ship. O'Brien then checks another console and says it's carrying something inside. It's a life form. Kira, not taking any chances, calls for a yellow alert. She then orders everybody to secure Ops. Kira then gives the order to O'Brien to beam the object aboard, but within a containment field. O'Brien teleports the orb onto the pad, and then all of a sudden, Dax appears on the teleportation pad. Both Kira and Brian are confused about the whole situation. Sisko, now in the bright light void, starts to get flashbacks to different times in his life. Sisko then asks, "Who are you?" Then he gets a few more images, but all these images are of Sisko's past events in history, except for one. This random picture of this lady who I don't even think is in this episode, other than this part. The image of Jennifer responds by saying, "It's corporeal, a physical entity." Sisko, still dazed, asks, "What did you say?" And then an image of Captain Picard appears and confirms that Sisko is responding to auditory and visual stimuli with linguistic communication. Sisko finally responds and agrees, yes, linguistic communication. And then we get an image of Kaiopaka asking Sisko what he is. Sisko retorts his species is human and he comes from a planet called Earth. And then we get an image of Jake asking, "Earth, what is this?" This is just the beginning of a slew of questions asked by the prophets. Sisko responds to Jake that the setting around him is what Earth looks like, and that they are two very different species. He adds, it will take time to understand each other. The image of Jake Sisko then responds back, "Time? What is this time?" And oh, we will get into this in a minute or two. But Sisko sits there for a second, not knowing how to respond to this question, and he's still held fast by the bright light void. Back on DS9, we get a first officer's log, 46392.7, from Major Kira, detailing that they are going to mount a rescue mission to find Commander Sisko. But before they do, Dax needs to recalibrate the navigational sensors to work under these new conditions. Dax explains to everyone that this is not a normal wormhole, and it is not a naturally created phenomenon. Julian interjects, "Not natural? You mean it was constructed?" Dax confirms that not only did these aliens make the orbs, but they also constructed the wormhole. O'Brien then mentions the Cardassians are now leaving orbit and heading to the Denorius belt. Kira, now seeing the strategic value of the wormhole, asks O'Brien what it would take to move the station to the wormhole's opening. O'Brien responds that the station isn't a ship. They only got 6 thrusters, and a 160,000-kilometer trip would take over 2 months. Kira, not happy with this, responds that it's got to be there tomorrow. O'Brien then laughs and says that's just not possible. But then Dax comes out and suggests that they modify the subspace field output of the deflector generators just enough to create a low field around the station. O'Brien responds to lower the mass of the station. Dax adds that if you could lower the mass of the station, then the 6 thrusters will be all they need. She adds they can inform Starfleet for help. O'Brien then says the Enterprise is still the closest ship at 2 days away, and lowering the mass of the station could tear DS9 apart. Kira then gives command of the station over to O'Brien, and then leaves for the wormhole along with Dax and Bashir. Odo decides to follow. While on the way to the runabout, Odo convinces Kira, who's extremely hesitant at first, to let him go along because he's head of security. He also adds that he was found at the Denorius Belt, and he knows nothing of his past or his people. Kira complies with Odo's request, and they all head off. And then we get a nice reused stock shot of a runabout leaving DS9, as Kira, Dax, Bashir, and Odo head off to the Denorius Belt. And then we fade into Act 6. Back inside the wormhole, Sisko is held fast by the white light void, and then we get an image of Jean-Luc Picard saying this line.
The creature must be destroyed before it destroys us.
What is this? Time.
Before it destroys us.
Time.
Before it destroys us. Time.
So, we find out beforehand from the image of Jake that the wormhole aliens have no concept of linear time, yet they want to destroy Sisko before he destroys them. So, the wormhole aliens keep on barraging Sisko with more images of his past, and they are definitely not voting in his favor right now. The wormhole aliens are now just laying all the compliments on Sisko right now, calling him aggressive, adversarial, and malevolent. Sisko comes back and tries to convince the aliens that he is not their enemy. He gets tossed back and forth from place to place as he tries to explain humanity to these aliens. He goes into the deep specifics about how linear time works and tries to communicate this to the aliens. And to be honest, some of the questions that these aliens are asking are the same discussions I had with my child when he was 2 years old. Seriously. But just about the same time that Sisko finally starts getting through to these aliens, we dip back to him again being held by the bright light void. Meanwhile, back on DS9, you can see the crew is starting the process of lowering the station's mass as a bubble starts to form around the outside. The station fires up its thrusters and starts to move, but it's shaking because the field around it is still not stable. O'Brien tries to get the computer to respond to his requests, but it keeps on blocking his requests with warnings. O'Brien, now starting to get extremely upset, says screw it, he will do it manually. With the help of another ensign, O'Brien manages to stabilize the field around DS9, and the station begins to fly off on its course. O'Brien, frustrated with the computer, tells the computer that they're gonna have a little talk. And to be honest, I love this scene with Calmini, but I really wanted to hear what the computer's response was. Back on the runabout, Kira and the crew are headed to the wormhole to find Commander Sisko. Dax informs the shuttle crew that the Cardassian warship is in sight and headed for the wormhole. Julian adds that they should listen to reason, but Odo is quick to retort that most of the Cardassians he know wouldn't know reason if it came up and shook their hand. Kira then hails the Cardassian warship and then gets Gul Dukat. Kira explains to Dukat that the wormhole may be dangerous. Dukat then denies Kira's accusation, saying perhaps the wormhole aliens would be much nicer to Cardassians. Odo then interjects and explains to Dukat that these people are only trying to help him. Dukat pays no attention to the warning, claiming that Sisko is meeting the aliens in the wormhole to barter for their technology. Dukat then abruptly ends the transmission and begins to continue on for the wormhole. Odo then looks back to Bashir and says, "So much for reason." Back inside the wormhole, the aliens keep up their interrogation of Sisko by asking him question after question. Sisko finally comes to, and he is lying down next to Jennifer on the ground. The alien then responds with Jennifer's name. Both Sisko and the alien Jennifer get up, and we can see that they are in a park. Sisko confirms that her name was Jennifer, and he begins to say that he lost her. The alien Jennifer then responds with, "Lost? What is this?" These aliens have no concept of time, yet they want to destroy Sisko before he destroys them. Sisko finds himself explaining linear time yet once again. The alien Jennifer then responds that this is inconceivable. How can any beings live like this? She then adds that Sisko is deceiving them. Sisko again explains that he is not deceiving them, and that this day, albeit 15 years ago, was one of the most important days of his life. He adds this day shaped each day after this one. And then they hear children playing in the background. And then Sisko and alien Jennifer look over and they see the actual scene of Sisko and Jennifer 15 years ago play out in front of their eyes. As they watch the scene with the other Sisko and Jennifer play out, they kiss. Alien Jennifer then asks Sisko what the kissing was all about. Sisko replies pleasure. and of course then offers the explanation once again about how pleasure works among humans. And then Sisko gets teleported back to the Saratoga at Wolf 359. He starts walking down the corridor and says to the aliens that it's hard to be here. The alien Jennifer then walks out of flames and responds, "But if you don't want to be here, then why do you exist here?" But before he can muster up an answer, we dip back to Sisko held in the bright light void, asking, "What's wrong?" And then we get a picture of Dukat and his Gaylor-class warship heading through the wormhole. It eventually makes it out the other side. And then back on the shuttle, the crew gets ready to enter the wormhole. They finally reach the coordinates of the wormhole, and it opens up, but then it instantly closes on them. Now at a loss for words, Kira and the crew wonder what they are going to do now. And then we fade into Act 7. So, we fade into Sisko inside the wormhole, still held by the white light void, but really up close this time. Sisko, in a panic, asks the aliens what is wrong. Then we get a picture of Sisko and Alien Jennifer on the beach. Alien Jennifer responds that more of your kind has come through the passage. Sisko responds, "The wormhole?" Then of course we get the typical alien response once more, "Wormhole? What is this?" And of course, like every other time, Sisko goes in to explain that this is the term they use to describe the alien's passage. And then we get an alien Picard telling Sisko that the passage has been terminated. And then we get teleported back to the bridge of the Saratoga, as the crew members of the Saratoga are now telling Sisko that his linear nature is destructive and all humans act without consequences. Sisko defends against his accusation, saying that humans are aware of everything they do and accept the consequence that it brings. The Vulcan captain then steps up saying, "But you claim that you don't know what the consequence will be." Sisko then unapologetically replies, "We don't." Then we get a shot of Sisko and Jake on the bridge asking, "How can you be responsible for your actions then?" Sisko then of course goes into another explanation saying that we used our past experiences to decide a better outcome for the future. He adds that with his wife Jennifer, they accepted all the consequences that would happen when they got married, including Jake. And then we get a shot of Alien Jennifer giving birth to Jake Sisko, and she replies, "Your child with Jennifer?" And then finally starting to understand a little bit, Alien Jennifer says, "Linear procreation?" Sisko adds that, yes, Jake is the continuation of our family. And then we fade in on the adversarial aggressive baseball guy again.
Aggressive. Adversarial.
I don't know why I love this clip so much, but I just do. But they all end up on the baseball field, and Sisko replies, "For competition and fun." And then Alien Jake steps forward, who is now dressed in a catcher's uniform, and asks the age-old prophet question, "Baseball? What is this?" And of course, once more, Sisko goes into explaining how baseball works to the aliens. But then he points out that the rules don't matter as much as the fact that the game is linear. He goes on to explain that when you throw the baseball, many possibilities can happen, and you have to plan a strategy for the outcome. And then Alien Jake says, "You value your ignorance of what is to come?" Sisko retorts, "Yes, perhaps that's the most important thing to know about humans. The game itself wouldn't be worth playing if you already knew how it was going to end." Sisko then adds that each time the ball is thrown, the game starts to take shape. And then finally, the adversarial aggressive baseball guy steps up, and you don't know what shape it's going to be until it's completed. Maybe they're starting to get it, maybe not. Well, anyway, let's find out. We then get whisked back away to Sisko's quarters on the Saratoga, standing above Jennifer's body. The aliens, now taking the form of the Bolian lieutenant from the Saratoga, ask then, why does Sisko exist there? Sisko then pulls himself back from the wreckage, looking down at Jennifer with a loss for words. He doesn't understand why the aliens keep bringing him here. And then we dip back to Sisko held by the white light void, but even more up close than before. And then back on DS9, we get a first officer's log from Kira, explaining that they have met back up with DS9 and are at the last coordinates where the wormhole had disappeared. She adds that there's no sign of Commander Sisko or Gul Dukat ship, and 3 Cardassian ships have just entered the sector, and that these ships will no doubt be looking for Gul Dukat really soon. Kira then asks O'Brien to erect a high-energy Thoron field so the Cardassians can't scan the station's defense systems when they arrive. O'Brien complies with Kira's request, and then Dax mentions to Kira that the Cardassian ship is hailing them. Kira tells Dax to put it up on the screen. The Cardassian on the screen introduces himself as Gul Jasad, from the 7th Order and then demands to know where their warship went. Kira says with any luck, it's in the Gamma Quadrant through the wormhole. Jasad then retorts, what wormhole? Now obviously starting to get irritated over the ordeal, he adds that there's no sensor information of a wormhole being present in this area. Kira then replies, that's because it's collapsed. Dax then jumps in and explains to Jasad that the wormhole was artificially created and that's why it didn't show up on their sensor sweep. Jasad, who is now visibly angry at the whole notion, replies to Kira and Dax saying, do they expect him to believe that someone artificially created a wormhole and then disassembled it? Kira then confirms this absolutely crazy story, and then Jasad, who looks like he's about to blow his lid, ends the communication. Dax then tells Kira that the Cardassians are flooding the area with lepton interference to cut the station's communications off. O'Brien adds that the ships are powering up their phaser banks. Kira then orders the station to go on red alert, and then tells the crew to raise the shields. O'Brien looks at her and says, what shields? Dax says, they're hailing us again. Kira then straightens herself out and says, put it on. Jasad then once again comes on the screen, and he says he doesn't accept their explanation. He also accuses them of destroying Gul Dukat's ship, but he doesn't know how. Kira tries to say something, but then is cut off by Jasad, who is now saying that he wants the unconditional surrender of the station, or they're going to open fire. Kira tells Jasad okay, but she will need at least a day to make the necessary preparations. Jasad, who's had enough at this point, gives Kira 1 hour to make a decision, and then he cuts out. Kira and the rest of the crew now know that surrender is not an option. Hello everybody, this is Ensign Rickey, and this concludes the first part to my 2-part review of the Deep Space Nine series opener, Emissary. Part 2 of this video review will pick up at Act 8 and then continue on through all the statistical data I have gathered for this episode, which is a lot. Keep in mind that all these video reviews that I do that are season openers tend to have a lot of information in it, so these videos will be extra long. And with that being said, I'd like to give you a thanks for watching, and an extra thanks if you made it this far, because none of my videos are on the short side of length by any means whatsoever. So, if you like this video and you like what I do, please like, comment, and subscribe on it. And don't forget to hit the bell notification to stay informed for when I release new content. But until then, my name is Ensign Rickey, your YouTube resident redshirt. This is the Lower Decks, and I hope you enjoyed the show.